I want to include information about my mother and introduce her into the narrative. She was born in 1902 and in Center County, Pennsylvania, in a little town called Phillipsburg. And her mother and father were both widowed or widowered and had previous children by their spouses. Mom's dad had 7 children by his first wife, and apparently her mother only had one boy who was seriously injured in World War I by a chlorine gas that he had inhaled. His lungs and throat were severely damaged and he could barely speak above a whisper. I only recall seeing him when I was a very small child, and I don't think he lived to be a much older man. My grandfather's name was Beamer, B-E-A-M-E-R, but the original spelling was B-O-H-M-E-R. It originated from Switzerland, according to the information we have, but it's apparent that they were originally German and had moved to Switzerland sometime in the past. They settled in Virginia probably about 1780, and during the subsequent years gradually moved west to Center County, and where my grandmother and grandfather were both born. My grandfather's family was pretty active in the Civil War. His brother and cousins and so forth, 3 of them were soldiers. One was a drummer boy who was starved to death in Andersonville, Georgia, prison camp. One, Alvin, was killed at Gettysburg and is buried there. The other brother survived the war. A violin that was carried by my grandfather's uncle during the Civil War was given to my mother, then to me, and I have it. In 2012, through strange circumstance, I encountered a retired ER doctor that lives in Boise, Idaho, and during our conversation I mentioned that I had this old violin that had been through the Civil War, and it looked too, it was in pretty bad shape. The top was all warped and the case was full of punctured, broken in many places. It was really pretty terrible shape. He got all excited about it. He made violins as a hobby, and he wanted to repair my old violin. And I told him I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it because I didn't think it was worth anything, and it was fine the way it was as far as I was concerned. But he insisted, and he said he wouldn't charge me anything for it, just to send it out to Boise, and he would fix it. So I repaired the case and brought it back to a good functional situation, and I mailed the whole thing out to him. And he took it all apart, and he told me that the violin had been made around 1830 by a German violin maker, and he said it was a good violin, but the top had been removed probably in the 1880s when it became a fad to remove the tops of the violins and scrape the wood to a much thinner dimension than originally was installed, with the idea that the thin wood would increase the tone value and it would perform better. As a result, the top was really thin and it was warped, but he made calls and fixtures to straighten it out, and over a 6-month period he gradually, slowly worked the warpage out of it and reformed it and put a new finish on it. Well, he just did a tremendous amount of work, obviously, and sent it back to me. It really looks good. So I have the history of that violin documented with a picture of the uncle that carried it, and that's attached to the inside of the violin. But he warned me not to put strings on and tighten them up because he was concerned the top was weakened to the point where it wouldn't tolerate the tension load of the strings. He said I was welcome to try it, but he was one to caution me about the likely possibility of that happening. The hairs on the ball were totally torn and broken, so I removed all the traces of the hair. There was no hair on the ball, and I removed the strings of the violin, so the temptation to tighten it up is reduced. But it was an interesting story, and really unbelievable the way the contact was made with the doctor, and the fact that he was willing to spend all that time and effort on it. Grandpa was a stone cutter and built a lot of buildings and stuff around Phillipsburg. Around the turn of the century, he even had his own block making factory. 2 houses at stand that were made with blocks. I've included a picture of one of them here. Grandpa had lost an eye when a chip from a stone that he was cutting hit him in the pupil. And he was a middle-aged man when that happened, so I never saw him without this pair of glasses that he wore, and the lens on the left side was opaque and covered the empty socket. And when Grandpa was sitting down and I could see over the top of his glasses, I'd try to work my way around behind him and look down into them and see the empty socket. The eyelid on that eye was down, of course, and the socket was protected by the eyelid. It covered the whole thing. He really liked me, but we didn't visit very often. It was about 20 miles over there, and in those days, it was 20 miles of really bad road for the most part, and 20 miles might have well been 2,000. They visited once that I remember, but I always enjoyed going over because Grandpa treated me like I had some value. He was a patient man, and not, as I recall, he wasn't real tall, and he was fairly large around, not fat, but heavy. He liked to sit on a rocking chair on the lower porch of his house. They had a narrow, high house with 2 porches, and the ground floor was paved, and there were just 2 rooms on each floor. And the kitchen and kind of a basement was on the ground floor. The second floor had a parlor and some other room, I can't remember now. Then on the 3rd floor were the bedrooms. It was a kind of strange house, but it worked for them. And so when you parked, and it was on a fairly steep slope too, so we parked down on a flat ground, and then we walked up through the backyard and then into the basement kitchen. I don't think they got along very well. I know a few times that we were over there, they seemed to argue, and they just weren't happy with each other. Grandma seemed to me kind of, well, I didn't care much for her. She didn't exhibit any affection for me, I guess. Maybe Grandpa tried to make up for it, I don't know, but he died in 1936, so the last time that we were over there was probably sometime during 1935, because Dad was in the CC camps from 35 to 37. So I was probably 5 or 6 years old when he died. He was a patient and kind man. I remember him sitting on a lower porch there in a rocking chair, and a squirrel was on his lap, and he'd buy peanuts and boil them and feed the squirrel peanuts. And when he'd make a sound, that squirrel would come running and jump up on his lap, and he'd give it some peanuts, and he would grab a couple and then run back to the tree and back and forth. But it was pretty fascinating to see that. Not long after that, the neighbor's cat put an end to that squirrel, and Grandpa was really infuriated, and I don't blame him. So Grandpa had a .22, and he with the one eye, the left eye blind, the right eye apparently was extra powerful because he was a dead shot with that .22. So he lay in wait for that cat. And, the cat met its end as a result. Now that I recall, they came down to visit us twice. One time was when Grandpa was still pretty healthy enough to walk around and do things. And we had a lot of rats out in the barn. and we've been trying to trap them and so forth, but we hadn't caught them all. So Grandpa went out with the 22, and he lay there and wait, and pretty soon I hear a shot, and then pretty soon another one. And he put an end to a whole bunch of rats. I mean, he didn't miss. So the second time, though, they came, Grandpa was really sick. He died shortly after. He had something wrong in his stomach. I don't know if it was cancer or what it was, but he was all swollen, and he didn't move around much. He sat the whole time that they were there. But I remember hearing they had a Model A Ford. I remember hearing the Model A coming down the hill, the dirt road to the south of us, and somehow I knew it was them. And of course, we didn't have a telephone or anything, so their visit was totally unexpected. There was no communication before that. But somehow I knew it was their Model A, and I ran out to the road as they pulled up to the gate leading into the front yard. And when I was running out to the car, I tripped on a roofing nail with my right foot in the arch of it, and it was very, very painful, as you can imagine. I sat down on the ground, I pulled my foot up to see it, and I could see the head of it flush with the bottom of my foot. And I lay there, no doubt screaming. I don't remember that part, but Grandpa slowly got out of the car and came over to me, and he sat down on the ground. He grabbed my foot and he pulled the nail out. And I've thought about it since then. That must have been as grisly and difficult for him as it was for me. Poured some iodine on it and wrapped my foot with an old rag and went on about my business. It's incredible I didn't get an infection. Grandpa went to the hospital the next day after they were there, and he died in the hospital. That's right, I was in the second grade when he died. So that would have made me about 6 or 7. So that would have been 1936. It must have been just before Dad went to the CC camp. No, he went in 35. I don't know. Nevertheless, I was in grade school, I know. Ruth and I were in grade school, and she was a year behind me. She was in the first grade then. And it was in the afternoon in the fall, I recall that. And we heard this Model A coming up to the school, and it stopped. And there was a knock on the door, and the teacher went back, and the next thing you know, they were hustling Ruth and I out to the car. And it was George McCullum who was driving, which was one of Grandma's children. Yeah, that's right, it was one of Grandma's children and my mother's half-brother. I hadn't thought of that before, but he was 25 or so in those years. But he was driving the Model A. He was by himself, and he had come to Frenchville to tell Mom, and I remember Dad being around then. To come home from the CC camp because they went to the funeral, and Ruth and I stayed at the house by ourselves. And I remember them leaving for Phillipsburg and telling us to behave ourselves. I guess they left us there, all right, because there was nobody else around who could take care of us. And I don't know why they didn't take us to the funeral, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, I wanted Dad to get me the 22 from Grandpa, but he didn't do it. I guess he was afraid I'd hurt myself with it, but I wished I had it. One time when we visited Phillipsburg and Grandpa and Grandma, we parked at the top side of the house. There's a road that ran on the upper side of the house, and I don't know why Dad drove and parked up there, because that's not where we parked before, but there was just a short, maybe 10-15 feet to the front porch on the second floor from that parking space. But we went down around the house, and I remember hearing Grandma and Grandpa really fighting. They were pretty loud, and it was very pleasant visit. I don't know what the problem was, but they had had a big fight. Below Grandpa's house, there was a level field, a rather large field, 10, 15 acres, I would guess. And a circus had come to town and set their tents up and their show, amusement rides and whatever, there on that property, which was easily within sight of the house and not a long walk over to it. So I coaxed Grandpa to go over there and take me with him, of course. And we walked over there, and they had a circular track set up, several hundred feet in diameter, and they had little gasoline-powered cars for a nickel that you drive around this circular track for one time around. So Grandpa, I begged, Grandpa, let me drive, buy me a ticket, So Grandpa reached in his pocket and he had a little black wallet with a snap on it, sort of. You kind of twist it and it would unlatch and it would open up. And he had only 4 cents, and that's all he had in there. And he tried to get the ticket agent to sell him a ticket for 4 cents. And that ticket agent wouldn't do it. And Grandpa begged him to sell him the ticket, but he wouldn't do it. So I remember seeing a tear in Grandpa's eye. I wasn't really happy, to say the least, either. But poor old Grandpa, he just didn't. They were poor, and if it had been $10 and he'd had it, he'd have spent it. That's for sure. But anyway, we turned around and went back to the house. Kind of put a damper on Grandpa, that's for sure. I soon forgot about it, but although I remembered it when we got home, and it would have really been a thrill to do that. The other trip I remember making over there is when Grandma was dying. She was sick in bed, and she was they had a bed set up in a parlor on the second floor. Mom and her were talking about the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby back in about 31 or 32, something like that. Charles Lindbergh was a famous man, and he had just flown across the Atlantic singly in a single-engine airplane, and he was known over the world, worldwide, and he was a famous personage. Everywhere he went, he made speeches, and everybody knew about his terrific feat, and it was a terrific feat. He loaded his airplane with gasoline, and he could, to the point where he had tanks in the front where he couldn't even see out the windshield of that airplane. He flew by instruments the whole way. Of course, he could see out the sides, but he couldn't see ahead at all. It took 20-some hours to do it, too. And he had some close calls. He got down pretty low near the water, but anyway, he made it to Paris. And of course, thousands of people were waiting for him in Le Bourget airport there in Paris. And it was pretty exciting, but a couple of years later, I think it was about 33 or so, some idiot climbed up to the second floor of the Lindbergh house, which was a huge, whole 2-story house, and on a cold night, put a ladder against the house, climbed up into that baby's bedroom, and kidnapped it. Took it out of the bedroom, and of course they didn't discover it was missing until some time later when they went to feed him, or whatever the schedule was. But yeah, he was long gone by the time they discovered it, and they found this ladder leaning against the house. Oh gosh, it was worldwide news. Everybody was outraged. There was a lot of political stuff too, and some screwballs got involved with it and supposedly met the kidnapper, and they delivered quite a bit of money as a ransom. And the money disappeared, and then a few weeks later they found the baby's body in the woods not far from the house. This was in New Jersey. And the chief of the police department in New Jersey was a man by the name of Schwarzkopf. His son, General Schwarzkopf, led the invasion of Iraq. He was a shyster. he was always looking for his own good and whatever publicity he could claim, legitimately or not. He was always in every picture and in this fancy outfit that he wore. And they picked up this German immigrant, and they found some of the ransom money in his garage. So he was involved in some way, but it doesn't seem as though he was the actual kidnapper. Apparently he was holding some money for the real kidnapper, who had escaped to Germany by that time. And anyway, they railroaded that guy right through the trial. There were newspaper reporters from all over the world. It was a real circus, and the guy denied that he was responsible. But they had some evidence against him, and he was culpable anyway. They found him guilty and electrocuted him, but they didn't really catch the real kidnapper. That was a big topic of conversation even years after the event. And I remember Mom and Grandmother talking about it. And my grandmother said that someday the truth will leak out. And I heard that comment and I thought, how can it leak? What is it to leak? Is it a hole in a bucket or something? I didn't catch the analogy there. And so afterwards I realized what she meant. But I think I did. Maybe I still don't know. But anyway, Grandma died. And Ruth and I didn't go to that funeral either. I don't know why they never took us. But these pictures show the cemetery where they were buried, and other pictures of tombstones of Beamers. Of course, Grandma was from over the mountain, as they say, near Henderson, which doesn't exist today. Man that's in these photos is named Claire Simler, and he was a relative, and I'm not quite sure how he's connected, but he knew Grandpa really well. I met him, and he took me around to the cemeteries, and we found the location of the McCoys and burial plot there at the Phillipsburg Cemetery, where Grandma and Grandpa are buried. Claire Simler was an insurance salesman all his life, and he sold insurance all over the countryside, and he was well known in Frenchville. I know one story he told about going to Frenchville, coming up a long, twisting hill up the side of the mountain, and of course in those days, and it still isn't paved. He talks about coming up the side of the acclivity of the river hill with the steep mountain bank on the left and the long drop off into the river on the right. And of course there weren't any guardrails or anything, and the narrow dirt road going up the hill was treacherous. And he talks about sliding into the ditch and having to back down the hill and get another start at it. And apparently it left quite an impression on his mind, because years later when he wrote the genealogy for his side of the family, the Beamers and the others of his relations, he remembered vividly that event. Grandpa was telling me at one time, around 1900 I guess, his father had been buried, and they decided for whatever reason to move him into the large cemetery, dug up his casket, and they hauled it to the place where he is now. And before they put him in the ground, they decided to open the casket and see what he looked like. And they opened the casket and they were amazed that he was perfectly preserved. He looked exactly like himself, and all of a sudden, the whole appearance of him just disappeared in kind of dust. Apparently the body had deteriorated, but the skin had remained fairly intact until the additional oxygen from opening the casket hit it, and it just left it dissolved into the dust that it really was. And they were, the consternation reigned supreme, that's for sure. They were horrified to see that. And so they clamped the lid down and put him back down in where corpses belong. Grandpa kind of chuckled and laughed at that. He said, the women, I guess, really went bananas. As I recounted the story of great-grandpa's sudden disappearance. It reminded me of another story that my mother told me of a translated casket that had been opened and the body was on its stomach. I don't know how long the person had been dead, but this obviously happened before the common practice of embalming, and it's not a unique story, but apparently the person was still alive when it was buried and came to and, well, probably suffocated. It's a pretty horrifying thought to think that you would be buried alive, but apparently it did happen, and certainly my mother wouldn't have repeated it if she had first-hand knowledge of it. I remember Grandpa telling Dad during a conversation they were having about Ruth and I guess, and Grandpa said, well, out in the country is the best place to raise kids. I didn't agree with it then. I could see some of the better living standards that Grandpa and Grandma had. Even though they didn't have indoor plumbing, they at least had electricity, electric lights. But they had an outdoor privy, pretty common in those days. That reminds me, Grandpa told me one time they had neighbors, and the neighbor would empty the privy and haul the human waste out onto the garden. They weren't good as fertilizer, but just the thoughts of eating vegetables and so forth that had been fertilized by human excrement was more than he could stomach. Although it's done many places in the world where that's the only fertilizer available. We fertilized our garden with cow manure. It was good fertilizer. There was a house next door to Grandpa's, a huge old house, 2 stories and on the side of a hill, so the lower side was really high off the ground. And it was pretty well ramshackle. The front porch had a big sag in it, but the porch itself was huge. This was a very substantial house in its day, but some windows were broken out, and people were living there who really didn't have anything. And Grandma told me that their son, who was a little older than me, well, he was probably 12 or 13 then, was bedfast because he had scarlet fever, and the doctor wouldn't let him out of bed. So he had to stay in his bedroom all the time until he was healed, which they didn't know how long that would be. So she told me that I should go over and visit him. Well, I went over there, and this was after Grandpa died. My grandmother died in 1939, so I was probably 9 or 10 years old then. I really wasn't too keen about doing it, but I went over anyway, and I knocked on the door, and the mother opened the door, and she invited me in. I mean, it was very, very friendly. And the house had these big rooms, and the ceilings were high, at least 10 feet. And it was just like a big barn, and there wasn't any furniture in the rooms. They were all mostly empty, maybe a few chairs. I don't remember even seeing any chairs, but there probably were chairs in the kitchen anyway. And she told me to go upstairs to his bedroom. And there was a big wide staircase leading upstairs. Nothing on the walls, and it was really almost an empty house. So I went into his bedroom, and he was laying there on a little cot, and there wasn't much in his bedroom either. There wasn't a dresser or anything. And he was lying there, and he had a box of firecrackers. And they were rather big ones too, much bigger than I was allowed to handle. And he had a whole bunch of Coke bottles, or pop bottles. And the window was open, great big window that slid up and down, and the bottom sash was up. And so when I think of this, it's crazy. He'd take one of these pop bottles, light that firecracker, drop it in that bottle, and then throw that bottle out the window. And his bed was not close to the window. It was probably 10 feet away from the window, maybe more. It was a long way. But he threw that bottle out the window, and of course when it got out there, firecracker went off and glass just flew every direction. If that thing would have hit the wall, bounced back in the room, he'd really been in trouble. So I I got out of there when he started doing it again. I just left. He was poor kid, you know. I can imagine how frustrated he was having to lie up there by himself. Without any entertainment. I mean, he didn't have radio or anything like that. But that was pretty dangerous entertainment. I think I'll end this one here since the time on it is getting too long.